Thank you, Shamindra. Good afternoon to all of you. As Shamindra said, this session is intended to be about the middle income trap. And if I'm not mistaken, the phrase joining the dots comes from Steve Jobs. I think in a celebrated lecture he gave at commencement at Stanford University, he spoke about his life and as to how he got to where he did get to, and he framed it around this phrase of joining the dots or connecting the dots. So what about this middle income country trap in relation to Sri Lanka? We've of course recently graduated to upper middle income country status, which implies that our per capita GDP is now a little over $4,000 US. The threshold for higher income countries is 12,000. So if we are to graduate out of this middle income country trap, we need to get to 12,000 USD per capita income. Now, if you look at a couple of scenarios as to how we might get there, if we are able to achieve an annual average growth of 8% rather, we will get there in 15 years. Now, a number of countries in East and Southeast Asia have averaged 8% over a sustained period of time, even double digits over a sustained period of time. But that was in a different world. We heard this morning that global growth has slowed down, and global trade, international trade, which used to grow significantly faster than global growth, is now growing at a slow pace than global growth. So it's a different world, tougher to achieve 8%, but not impossible. If we achieve the average growth rate that we recorded in the post-conflict era, which is 5.6% per annum, then we can get there in about 20 years. If we go at the 3 to 4% we've had in the last few years, clearly it's going to take even longer. So before I go any further, it might be worth kind of defining what this middle income country trap is. My understanding is that it comes about when a country's wages are high, so get to the point where they can no longer compete with other low-income countries on the basis of the wage competitiveness. That you are no longer a low-wage economy, and you can't compete on the basis of wages. But these economies cannot compete with the high-income countries because their productivity, innovation, competitiveness, etc. is not strong enough for them to be competitive. So they're stuck in the middle. Now the pressure really is to make a big push in terms of boosting competitiveness, boosting innovation, so that you become increasingly competitive higher up the technological ladder. So that is really the challenge, to get out of this middle income country trap. Before kind of trying to identify some of the dots we need to join up to achieve this objective of getting our productivity, our competitiveness up to speed, I'd like to share with you two paradigm shifts which have qualitatively changed the policy-making landscape. One is the very fact that we have graduated to a high-income country status, which means we are now even more subject to the discipline of rating agencies and international capital markets. And this discipline, or the need for discipline, is amplified by the fact that in the foreseeable future, we are going to have to raise about $3 billion from international capital markets. So that there is the discipline imposed by markets and rating agencies, and we have no choice. That reduces our room to maneuver in terms of policy options, in terms of policy space, and that's something we have to accept. Now, so you have this qualitative change taking place, and what does it imply? It implies that our macroeconomic policy management has to be very robust. And I will talk a little bit more in detail about what that entails. So that's one paradigm shift. this graduation and the exposure to markets and rating agencies and the discipline it imposes and the very limited room to maneuver we have in terms of policy options. Then the second, and what it does do is, as I said, puts a very high premium on sound macroeconomic management. The second paradigm shift I'd like to share with you is the fact that, unusually, we are beginning to age before we actually had our economic transformation. We're having a demographic transition before our economic transformation. As somebody put it, we are getting old before we got rich. So that is a challenge. Two things there. Once the demographic pyramid begins to get inverted, it becomes much more difficult to drive growth through merely labor augmentation. When you have the pyramid in the normal way, more and more people come onto the labor market, and that helps you, provided you create enough jobs, that helps you to drive growth without having to pay too much attention to productivity, innovation, etc. But once you start aging, you have to drive growth much more through, again, increases in productivity. Now, we've averaged 1% growth in productivity now for several decades. We simply can't go on like that. If we do, we will definitely never get out of that middle-income country trap. So, in fact, this need to improve productivity and innovation, etc., comes through two channels. One is we're saying the aging, and the other we're saying is also because we are the need we have in terms of diversifying our economy and becoming more competitive with higher income countries. So both those, one to competitiveness, to get up the technological ladder and have the space to keep growing, and the other is because of aging, we have no choice but to drive growth through higher productivity. So now, let me now look at those two things. One, as I said, the first paradigm shift needs macro stability and fundamentals. The second paradigm shift needs the growth framework of the economy to be improved through higher productivity and better innovation. So let me take each of those in turn. What are the dots that need to be joined to achieve robust macro fundamentals? Now, a lot of you would have heard me talk about this, so I'm going to be very quick, and I'm happy to answer questions later on it. There has been universal concern expressed about the lack of consistency and predictability in the Sri Lankan policy framework. And a lot of that inconsistency comes about because of weak macroeconomic policies. The large budget deficit means that Sri Lanka tends to be a high inflation, high nominal interest rate, high overvalued currency economy. And that is exactly diametrically the opposite of the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia. And also, we have this boom-bust cycle. Essentially, often that boom-bust cycle is congruent with the electoral cycle. Sri Lanka, I think we are in the midst of our 17th IMF program. I don't know of any other country which has had more IMF programs. So we need to break that cycle. So the dots that we need to join up are related to having better frameworks for macroeconomic policy making. So on the monetary policy side, the central bank has now pretty much transitioned to a flexible inflation targeting regime. The inflation target is 4 to 6%. I mean, there are different regimes for monetary policy. You can anchor use the exchange rate as the anchor. You can use the relationship between monetary aggregates and inflation as the anchor. Now, those two anchors we have found are not appropriate for us. The exchange rate is It's very difficult for a country like Sri Lanka with a current account deficit and the level of reserves we have to use the exchange rate as the anchor. Equally, for many years we used monetary aggregates, but now that relationship between monetary aggregates and inflation has got much weaker, which is why the central bank embarked about 7-8 years ago to explore transitioning to a flexible inflation targeting regime. And that's what has happened. It's pretty much in place. And so there's a clear framework. You have an inflation target, and you set your monetary policy to reach that target, and you set policy in a proactive, forward-looking, and data-driven way. And you keep out fiscal considerations. The fiscal domination of the past is something that we now want to move away from. I think something that's going to ask me about monetary policy, so I'm not going to go into the Monetary Law Act at this point, because I suspect you're going to ask me about it, so in the interest of time, I won't talk about the new Monetary Law Act at this point. But so there is a clear framework for monetary policy, which is a flexible inflation targeting framework. And flexible inflation targeting rather than inflation targeting, because some people say, well, look, we're a developing country, we need to have some flexibility in terms of stabilizing the output gap. Are you putting yourself into a straitjacket? Which is why we have flexible inflation targeting rather than inflation targeting. So that under the new law, for instance, the minister will be able to change the inflation target, but then have to issue a gazette as to why he has done so. So we do take into account other objectives than purely inflation targeting. Inflation targeting will be the core objective of the central bank going forward. Financial system stability will also be an important objective, but the main objective will be inflation targeting. But in the context of output stabilization and taking into account the utilization of productive resources. That's why it is flexible inflation targeting. The other details of the Monetary Law Act I'll get to hopefully during the Q&A. So that's the framework for monetary policy. Now, within a flexible inflation targeting regime, the exchange rate is the first line of defense against shocks. It's the shock absorber. So you have to have a flexible exchange rate under the inflation targeting regime. So we now do not defend any particular rate, nominal or real. And we manage the exchange rate flexibly, but the central bank does intervene in the market to smoothen out a disorderly adjustment in the market. We have a very thin market. It ranges between 40 million and 100 million per day. So, for instance, if there is some capital outflow from the government's movement, somebody wants to take 15 million out, it creates pressure in the market. So in such a context, clearly the central bank has to intervene to smoothen out those disorderly adjustments which are not aligned with the underlying fundamentals. Essentially, the FX market, you have to look at the inflows, you look at the outflows, and if they're balanced, then broadly balanced, there should be pressure in the exchange rate. If, for instance, you have these capital outflows, which can be disruptive, then the central bank does intervene. Otherwise, it's a flexible management of the exchange rate. So that's the second framework. The third framework relates to the government's fiscal operations. There's a Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, but it lacks teeth. Now, there are going to be new fiscal rules. I think there's a cabinet paper going up next week, which will enhance the rules within the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, and there will be very specific reasons given for which the government can deviate from the targets it set for itself, particularly the primary balance. And if it does deviate, it has to indicate how it is going to come back in line. So that's again an enhancement. So what we're trying to do is set these frameworks in place and also trying to institutionalize them in law so that there is clarity and predictability. The final framework relates to debt management, to liability management. There you would have probably seen that the Active Liability Management Act was introduced last year. this enables the government to borrow over and above its requirement for under the Appropriation Act. That's its cash flow requirement in any given year. It can borrow over and above that, particularly for debt repayment, for liability management. Again, there's a separate act, and these operations are under careful parliamentary scrutiny, and with parliamentary approval, this additional money can be raised and placed in ring-fenced accounts which are earmarked purely for liability management. And the first such operation is just started. The RFPs have been put out for a samurai bond issuance, and the 500 million USD, or at least the yen equivalent of 500 million USD, which we hope to raise, will be put in this ring-fenced account. So there are these clear frameworks for macroeconomic policy making, and if you join those dots up, I hope in terms of getting sort of good macro outcomes, we will be in a much better place than we have been in the past. Now, so that's one part of the story, that is the macro fundamentals. What about driving productivity, driving innovation, improving competitiveness, basically strengthening the growth framework of the economy? And there are a number of dots again that need to be joined up. Clearly, the growth model for a country with 22 million people, 21, 22 million people, has to have export expansion as part of the narrative. And whether you're as large as China or small as Singapore, FDI has played an important role in export transformation. I mean, you heard in the speeches in the morning how our export performance and our FDI performance has been well below par when we compare ourselves with the most successful countries in Asia. So we have to up our game on both fronts. When it comes to exports, historically, we've had an anti-export bias in our policy framework. The exchange rate has tended to be overvalued. An overvalued exchange rate basically subsidizes foreign producers at the expense of domestic producers. Both exporters and producers of import competing goods are disadvantaged by an overvalued exchange rate. What it does do is help the consumer. Now that's why politically people have wanted an overvalued exchange rate, because there are many more consumers than there are exporters and producers of import competing goods. Many more votes. So the pressure has always come from the political front to have an overvalued exchange rate. And that is why we have basically, one of the reasons why our export performance has been so poor. Another reason is the most dynamic component of the international trading system are the regional and global supply chains. Now, in these kind of cross-border production sharing networks, when you operate within them, the distinction between imports and exports gets blurred. You bring stuff in, you do your little bit, and you send it out. Now, if you put a para-tariff in the middle of that, you're uncompetitive, and you're out of the game. We've got a series of para-tariffs, and our performance in terms of plugging into regional and global supply chains has been pretty abysmal. So the government is in the process of dismantling these para-tariffs, and with a more competitive exchange rate and these para-tariff removal, we should have a much better chance of penetrating global and regional supply chains. Some of the other things that we need to do, and I'm going to run through this very quickly, I'm happy to answer questions. You look at the factor markets. I mean, in the 1980s, I was seconded from the central bank to the finance ministry, and I was, Mr. Ronnie DeMel was the finance minister at that time, and I was his bag carrier, and one of my jobs was sometimes to put together some notes for his speeches. Now, the notes I write for my own speeches are pretty much the same as the notes I wrote for him. Essentially over now 35 or whatever it is years, nothing has changed. We have known what to do. We have known that we have to improve the performance of our factor markets, that are land market, that are capital market, that are labor market. I mean, for years, decades, we've known what to do, but we have not got it done. If we want to break out of the middle-income country trap, we have to get it done. There is no two ways about it now. We are in a different paradigm. Similarly, the business climate. Some work has been done, I know, and the BOI has set up these task forces. There's trying to put together a single window investment platform. We need to move much faster, get that in place, and go up the DBI ranking fairly quickly. On investment promotion, we need a much more focused attempt, and that is what I think Ricardo Hausmann and his team from Harvard have worked with the BOI to have a much more focused investment promotion program. Because you need a few big anchor investors, ideally, in the sectors that you feel you're competitive in. 40% of Vietnam's exports at the beginning of their export story was accounted for by Samsung. I think in Costa Rica, and this is the most vivid example, 75% of their exports at the beginning of their export transformation was accounted for by Intel. So if you can get a few big anchor investors to come, that helps the transformation very quickly. Same with trade facilitation. The single electronic window, I remember the Australian High Commissioner saying that he went and opened it, but I don't think it's fully in place yet. So we need to get these things done. We've been talking about it for a long time. Somehow we haven't quite finished the job. So this is what, if you want to join the dots properly, you have to finish the job, and you have to make sure that the process is completed, and that there are vested interests. Clearly this is not easy, but if we are to get out of this trap, these are things we have to get done. Trade policy, again, I think quite a lot of work has been done on that. There's a trade policy framework that has been produced, a national export strategy, then there is this trade adjustment package and a new commission that has been set up to examine how domestic industry can be supported as liberalization takes place under these trade agreements. And of course there are the trade agreements. The Prime Minister talked about them this morning. One angle about those is if we are able to complete the agreement with China and widen and broaden the agreement with India, we would be the only country in the world with preferential access to China, India, and Europe through GSP+, at least for a few years more. And that's really a USP in terms of attracting foreign investment. So if we get, it's not enough to do one or two of these things, you have to keep pressing on all fronts. The factor markets, business climate, investment promotion, trade facilitation, everything. You have to keep pushing. And we need to implement effectively and get the thing done. Now, different people blame different people. One lot, bureaucrats like me blame the politicians blame the bureaucrats. Others say the private sector, there are a bunch of rentier entrepreneurs, they're not really interested in improving the overall climate and driving the country forward. I think there's a little bit of truth in all of that, but we need to put all that behind us. And we need to operate as Sri Lanka Incorporated and drive the process forward if we are to get out of this trap. And if we can do some of these things, get the job done effectively, implement effectively, and you combine that with location and our international relations, and this elevated, enhanced interest in Sri Lanka, given the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, then I think, really, there is no reason why we can't get out of the trap, but it requires a lot of hard work. And a lot of hard work by Sri Lanka Incorporated. Thank you very much.